Some nights, Ethan Carter still reached across the empty side of the bed, forgetting for just a moment that Sarah was gone. The grief had stripped away everything, their home, their savings, and nearly his will to keep going. But watching his 8-year-old daughter Emma laugh as she skipped stones across the alpine lake, he knew they'd made the right choice. The 400-year-old floating cabin had cost him their last $1,000. The locals called it cursed. The realtor had seemed desperate to sell it. Ethan saw something different in the weathered wood and gentle sway of their new home. For the first time since the funeral, Emma was smiling again. The old cabin creaked like a lullaby at night, and morning sunlight danced through windows that had watched over this lake for centuries. What would they discover when Emma found that loose floorboard beneath the stone hearth? Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the cabin's diamond-paned windows, casting rainbow prisms across the worn pine floors. Ethan Carter stood in the doorway of what had once been a master bedroom, holding Sarah's leather journal against his chest. The pages were filled with her sketches of their dream home, a place by the water where Emma could grow up surrounded by nature's quiet wisdom. How eerily those sketches resembled the floating cabin they now called home. "Daddy, look," Emma's voice carried from the main room, bright with the kind of wonder that had been absent from their lives for too long. She stood at the stone hearth, her small hands tracing the intricate carvings that decorated the mantelpiece. "There are little animals hiding in the wood." Ethan tucked Sarah's journal into his back pocket and joined his daughter. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Deer leaping through carved forests, fish swimming upstream through wooden currents, and birds taking flight from branches that seemed to grow naturally from the stone. Each figure was no larger than Emma's thumb, yet perfect in every detail. "Whoever built this place was a master," Ethan murmured, running his calloused carpenter's fingers along the seamless joints. In his 20 years of woodworking, he'd never seen anything approaching this level of artistry. The wood seemed almost alive, as if it might continue growing if left undisturbed. The cabin sat on a foundation of massive cedar logs, lashed together with iron rings that showed no signs of rust, despite their obvious age. The entire structure rose and fell gently with the lake's rhythm, connected to the shore by a floating walkway of the same weathered cedar. When Ethan had first seen the listing online, he'd assumed it was some kind of elaborate joke. Who builds a house on water? But standing here now, feeling the subtle motion beneath his feet, he understood the genius of it. The cabin didn't fight the lake, it danced with it. "The realtor said it was built in the 1600s, Ethan told Emma, settling beside her on the hearth's stone ledge. "That would make it older than most cities in America." Emma's eyes widened. "Did they have electricity back then?" "No, sweetheart. See these thick walls? They're designed to hold heat from the fireplace. And look up there." He pointed to the heavy wooden beams that supported the ceiling. Oil lamps hung from iron hooks, their brass surfaces polished smooth by centuries of use. They used flame for light. The main room of the cabin was surprisingly spacious, with the stone hearth dominating one wall and built-in shelving carved directly into the others. A narrow staircase led to a loft bedroom, where Emma had claimed the space beneath the eaves, declaring it the perfect size for a princess castle. The kitchen was simple but functional, with a hand pump that drew water from the lake through some ingenious filtration system Ethan was still trying to understand. But it was the details that captured his imagination. Every doorframe was carved with flowing patterns that seemed to tell a story. The floorboards were fitted so precisely that not even a knife blade could slip between them. Most remarkably, despite the cabin's age, nothing sagged or creaked with weakness, only with the comfortable sounds of a home well loved. "Mrs. Henderson said the man who built this was a ghost," Emma announced, referring to the elderly woman who ran the small grocery store in Pine Ridge, the closest town some 15 miles down the mountain road. "And Mrs. Henderson has quite an imagination," Ethan replied, though he'd heard similar stories from 3 other locals during their supply runs. The tales varied in details, but shared common themes. A mysterious craftsman who appeared around the lake in the late 1600s, worked alone for decades, then vanished as suddenly as he'd arrived. Some claimed he'd built other structures around the lake that could only be seen on the foggiest mornings. Others insisted his ghost still wandered the shoreline on winter nights. Ethan was a practical man who believed in what he could touch and measure. But even he had to admit there was something unusual about their new home. The cabin seemed to anticipate their needs. The morning sun hit the eastern windows at just the right angle to wake them gently. The prevailing winds caught the roof's pitch perfectly, creating a natural ventilation system that kept the air fresh without being drafty. Even the stone hearth drew smoke flawlessly, never filling the room with ash or soot. "I like our ghost," Emma declared with 8-year-old certainty. He knew how to make houses happy. Perhaps that was the best way to describe it. The cabin felt happy. Not in some mystical sense, but in the way a perfectly tuned instrument feels right in a musician's hands. Every element worked in harmony with every other element, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. It reminded Ethan of Sarah's approach to their old garden. She'd never force plants to grow where they didn't want to be. Instead, she'd observed what thrived naturally, then gently guided it toward beauty. The cabin felt like the architectural equivalent of her garden, not imposed upon the landscape, but grown from it. The first week had been an adjustment. Emma had been frightened by the constant motion at night, the gentle rocking that was so different from their apartment's stillness. But gradually, she'd begun to find it soothing. Last night, Ethan had found her sound asleep, with one hand trailing in the water through a gap in her bedroom floorboards, as if she were petting the lake itself. Their nearest neighbors were the Kowalski family, who lived in a conventional house on the western shore about a mile away. Tom Kowalski was a retired forest ranger who'd been keeping an eye on the cabin for the previous owner's estate. His wife, Anna, had brought them a casserole and stayed for coffee, sharing what little she knew about the cabin's history. "The family that owned it never lived here," Anna had explained, her Polish accent softening her words. "They inherited it from some distant relative and just let it sit. The lawyers were happy to sell it to anyone willing to take it off their hands. But you should know, others have tried living here before. None lasted through the first snowfall." When Ethan had asked why, Anna had shrugged uncomfortably. Different reasons. Some said it was too isolated. Others claimed they heard things at night, voices in languages they didn't recognize. One family insisted the cabin was changing when they weren't looking, rooms appearing that hadn't been there before. Emma had found these stories delightful rather than frightening. She'd spent hours searching for secret passages and hidden rooms, declaring herself the cabin's official explorer. So far, her expeditions had yielded nothing more mysterious than a family of mice living beneath the kitchen floorboards and a collection of old bottles tucked behind the water pump. But even Ethan had to admit there were oddities. The cabin seemed larger inside than its exterior dimensions should allow. He'd measured the outside walls and compared them to the interior space, finding a discrepancy he couldn't quite account for. The built-in shelving held more books than seemed physically possible, and sometimes, late at night, when the lake was perfectly still, he could swear he heard the sound of distant hammering, rhythmic and purposeful, as if someone was still at work somewhere in the depths of the structure. "Can we explore the shore today?" Emma asked, pulling him from his reverie. She'd changed into the overalls and rain boots that had become her daily uniform, ready for whatever adventure the day might bring. After breakfast, Ethan agreed. They'd been here 2 weeks now, and he was still discovering new aspects of their floating home every day. Yesterday, he'd noticed that the cabin's position on the lake wasn't random. It sat at the exact center of a natural basin, equidistant from all the surrounding peaks. From their deck, they had a perfect view of 5 different waterfalls that cascaded down the mountainsides. As Emma chatted about her plans for the day, Ethan found himself thinking about the letter Sarah had written during her final weeks in the hospital. She'd made him promise to find a place where Emma could grow up feeling safe and loved, somewhere that would nurture her imagination and help her understand that the world was full of wonders worth protecting. Looking around their remarkable floating home, watching his daughter's excitement as she planned her daily adventure, Ethan felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had since her funeral. Not as a ghost or spirit, but as the continuing influence of her love, guiding them toward exactly what they needed. The cabin had cost them their last savings, but it had given them something priceless in return: hope. For the first time since Sarah's diagnosis, Ethan could imagine a future that held joy alongside the grief, purpose alongside the loss. Whatever secrets the cabin held, whatever stories the locals whispered about its mysterious builder, Ethan was grateful to be here. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen not through searching, but through simply being open to receive what life offered. He just had no idea how profoundly that truth was about to be tested. Emma's discovery came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after they'd settled into their floating home. The steady drumming of raindrops on the cabin's cedar shingle roof had created a cozy atmosphere that made indoor exploration irresistible to an 8-year-old with a boundless imagination. While Ethan worked on repairing a loose board in the kitchen, Emma had claimed the area around the stone hearth as her private domain. She'd arranged her collection of smooth lake stones in elaborate patterns across the wide stone ledge, creating what she called her magic circles. The warmth radiating from the banked fire made it the perfect spot for quiet play. "Daddy, this stone feels different," Emma announced, her small fingers tracing along the hearth's base where it met the wooden floor. Ethan looked up from his work, watching his daughter's intense concentration. She had Sarah's gift for noticing details others missed. "Different how, sweetheart? It's warm, but not from the fire, and it sounds hollow when I tap it," she demonstrated, knocking her knuckles against what appeared to be a perfectly fitted stone at the hearth's corner. Setting down his tools, Ethan joined her on the floor. Emma was right. The stone did sound different, more like wood than granite. Running his hands along its edges, he found what his practiced fingers recognized immediately: a seam so fine it was nearly invisible, but definitely there. "I think you might have found something interesting, Em." Working together, they discovered that the stone was actually a masterfully carved piece of wood, stained and textured to match the hearth perfectly. With gentle pressure in just the right spot, it pivoted on hidden hinges, revealing a cavity beneath the floorboards. Emma S gasp of delight echoed through the cabin as they peered into the hidden space. Nestled in a bed of what appeared to be preserved moss sat an ornate wooden box, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to dance in the firelight. "Can we take it out?" Emma whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the treasure disappear. Ethan carefully lifted the box, surprised by its weight. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every surface carved with flowing patterns that seemed to tell a story. Nordic-style dragons chased each other around the sides, while the lid depicted a vast lake surrounded by mountains, with a small structure floating at its center. "It looks like our cabin," Emma breathed, tracing the carved floating structure. With one finger. The resemblance was unmistakable. Even the mountains matched the peaks visible through their windows. But most remarkable was the level of detail in the carving. The artist had captured not just the cabin's shape, but its character, the way it sat in harmony with the water and sky. The box was secured with an intricate brass lock that was clearly part of the original design. But even as Ethan examined it, Emma's intuitive fingers found a sequence of hidden pressure points along the carved dragons. With a soft click that sounded like a contented sigh, the lock opened. Inside, nestled in compartments lined with faded silk, lay treasures that made both father and daughter catch their breath. There were 3 leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed with age, but still flexible. A collection of hand-drawn maps on what appeared to be specially prepared parchment. Several small wooden tokens, each carved with symbols neither of them recognized. And most intriguingly, a collection of smaller wooden boxes, each one a puzzle, requiring specific manipulations to open. Emma immediately reached for one of the puzzle boxes, her nimble fingers exploring its surfaces. "They're like the toys Grandpa used to make me," she said, referring to Sarah's father, who'd been a woodworker before arthritis claimed his hands. Ethan opened the first journal with careful reverence. The pages were covered in text, written in what appeared to be multiple languages. Some characters looked Nordic, others resembled elaborate English script from centuries past. But scattered throughout the text were detailed diagrams of mechanical devices, architectural plans, and intricate drawings of natural objects. Leaves, flowers, fish, and birds, all rendered with scientific precision. On the journal's first page, in faded but still readable English, was written, "The Private Observations and Designs of Magnus Ericsson, Year of Our Lord 1689. May these words find worthy eyes when the time is right." "Magnus," Emma repeated, testing the name. "That's our ghost's name." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. The date placed the journal's creation during the period when locals claimed the mysterious craftsman had built the cabin. But holding the physical evidence in his hands made the stories feel suddenly, startlingly real. The maps were equally fascinating. They showed the lake and surrounding mountains with remarkable accuracy, but included features that didn't appear on any modern survey. Hidden caves marked with special symbols, underwater formations depicted in careful detail, and most mysteriously, several small structures scattered around the lake's perimeter, each marked with the same symbol that appeared on the wooden tokens. "Look at this one, Daddy." Emma had successfully opened her first puzzle box, revealing another carved token and a small piece of what appeared to be crystal. "It's got the same symbol as on the map." She was right. The token bore a mark that looked like a tree growing from water, its roots extending deep beneath the surface while its branches reached toward stylized stars. Simple yet elegant, it appeared dozens of times throughout the materials they'd discovered. As the afternoon wore on, they spread their findings across the hearth's wide stone ledge, creating an impromptu research station. Emma demonstrated a remarkable intuitive understanding of the puzzle boxes, opening 3 more before Ethan managed to solve his first. Each revealed similar contents, tokens, crystals, and small scrolls covered in symbols that seemed to be part of some larger code. The journals proved to be a mixture of technical notes, philosophical observations, and what appeared to be personal reflections. Magnus wrote about his work with a passion that transcended mere craftsmanship. He described wood as a living material that retained memory and intention, stone as the earth's way of holding ancient wisdom, and water as the medium through which all things found their proper balance. "He talks about the cabin like it's alive," Ethan murmured, translating a passage that had been written in relatively clear English. "Listen to this. The dwelling responds to its inhabitants' needs because it was grown, not built. Each beam was shaped while the tree still lived. Each stone was invited rather than forced into place. The lake itself approved the foundation before the first log was laid." Emma looked up from her puzzle solving with bright eyes. "That's why it feels so friendly." He asked the lake if it was okay first. The childlike simplicity of her interpretation somehow captured something the more elaborate language missed. Magnus hadn't just built a cabin, he'd created a partnership between human intention and natural forces. As evening approached, they carefully returned most of their discoveries to the wooden box, keeping out only one journal and one of the simpler maps for further study. The hiding place beneath the hearth had kept the materials in perfect condition for over 3 centuries. They deserved to be treated with corresponding care. But even as they restored the hidden compartment to its original appearance, both father and daughter understood that their quiet life on the lake had fundamentally changed. They were no longer simply residents of an unusual home. They were guardians of a mystery that stretched back through centuries. "What do you think Magnus wanted us to find this?" Emma asked as they prepared for bed. Ethan considered the question. Seriously, the hiding place had been designed to be discovered, but only by someone who spent enough time in the cabin to truly explore it. Someone who would treat the findings with respect rather than seeing them merely as curiosities or valuable antiques. "I think he wanted to share his story," Ethan said finally. "And maybe he knew that someday people like us would need to understand what he learned about living in harmony with the natural world." Emma nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Tomorrow, can we follow one of the maps? I want to see if those other places are real." Looking at his daughter's eager face, illuminated by firelight and filled with the kind of wonder that had been missing from their lives for too long, Ethan knew there was only one possible answer. "We'll start with the closest one," he promised. "But first, we need to learn everything we can about Magnus and what he was trying to accomplish." As Emma drifted off to sleep in her loft bedroom, Ethan remained by the fire, studying Magnus's journal by lamplight. The more he read, the more he realized they'd stumbled upon something far more significant than historical curiosities. Magnus hadn't just been a craftsman. He'd been an innovator, a philosopher, and possibly a guardian of knowledge that the world had forgotten it needed. The rain continued through the night, drumming gently on their floating home while inside. Surrounded by centuries-old secrets, father and daughter began a journey that would change not just their understanding of their new home, but their entire future. The antique compass was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Emma discovered it 3 days after their initial find, hidden within the most complex puzzle box they'd encountered so far. The bronze casing was warm to the touch and covered in symbols that matched those in Magnus's journals, while the needle itself appeared to be made from some kind of crystalline material that caught and reflected light in impossible ways. Most remarkably, the needle didn't point north. "It keeps moving," Emma observed, holding the compass at eye level and slowly rotating it, "but it always ends up pointing to the same place." She was right. No matter which direction they faced, the needle swung to indicate a specific bearing. Across the lake, toward a section of shoreline that appeared completely unremarkable from their floating vantage point. Ethan had spent the morning researching Magnus Eriksson online, using their satellite internet connection to dig through historical archives and genealogy websites. What he'd found was simultaneously tantalizing and frustrating. Magnus appeared in scattered records from the late 1600s, described variously as a master craftsman, a reclusive genius, and, in one particularly colourful account from a Puritan minister, a worker of wonders who consorts with spirits of the wilderness. The most substantial reference came from a Norwegian shipping manifest dated 1687, listing Magnus Eriksson as a passenger bound for the New World, along with sundry tools and materials for the crafting of dwellings in the Norse tradition. But after that, the historical record went silent, as if Magnus had simply vanished into the American wilderness. "Mr. Carter?" The voice from their dock interrupted Ethan's research. Through the window, he saw a well-dressed man in his 50s standing beside an expensive-looking SUV. "I'm Marcus Webb. I was hoping we could talk." Ethan stepped outside, immediately noting the man's careful assessment of the cabin and its surroundings. Marcus Webb had the polished appearance of someone accustomed to wealth, tailored clothes, expensive watch, confident posture that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. "I understand you've recently acquired this remarkable property," Webb continued, his smile practiced and professional. "I represent a consortium of collectors who specialize in historically significant structures. We'd be very interested in discussing a purchase." "It's not for sale," Ethan replied simply. Something about Webb's presence felt wrong, like discovering a predator had wandered into a peaceful meadow. Webb, Quote's smile didn't falter. "Of course, I understand your attachment to the place, but consider your daughter's future. A property like this, properly marketed to the right buyers, could set her up for life, college, graduate school, whatever opportunities she might want." The shoe mention of Emma made Ethan's protective instincts flare. "Like I said, it's not for sale. Perhaps we could discuss it over coffee. I'm staying at the Pine Ridge Inn for a few days, hoping to learn more about the area's history. I've heard fascinating stories about the craftsmanship evident in your cabin." Before Ethan could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, the Norse compass clutched in her small hands. Webb's eyes immediately fixed on the artifact, and Ethan saw something shift in the man's expression, a sharpening of interest that confirmed his suspicions about the collector's true motivations. "That's a beautiful piece," Webb said casually. "Antique compass, they don't make them like that anymore." Emma instinctively stepped closer to her father, sensing the same wrongness that Ethan felt. "It's not for sale either," she said with 8-year-old directness. Webb chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Smart girl. I'd be happy to authenticate it for you, though. I have considerable experience with Norse artifacts." The fact that Webb had identified the compass's origins so quickly only deepened Ethan's unease. This wasn't a casual collector making an opportunistic offer. This was someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "Thanks for the offer, but we're not interested," Ethan said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have plans for the day." Webb nodded graciously, but his eyes continued to catalogue every detail of the cabin's construction. "Of course, I'll be around for a few more days if you change your mind. Sometimes people discover that old properties come with unexpected responsibilities." After Webb drove away, Ethan found Emma studying the compass with renewed intensity. "He knew what this was," she said, "and he was lying about just wanting to buy the cabin." Her perceptiveness continued to amaze him. At 8 years old, Emma had already developed the kind of intuitive understanding of people that took most adults decades to acquire, if they ever did. "You're right," Ethan agreed, "which means we need to be very careful about who we trust." With what we've found, that afternoon they decided to follow the compass's guidance. Loading a backpack with water, snacks, and Magnus's maps, they took their small inflatable boat to shore and began hiking toward whatever the mysterious needle was indicating. The compass led them along an ancient deer path that wound through old-growth forest, past granite outcroppings carved smooth by glaciers, and over streams that sang with snowmelt from the surrounding peaks. Emma proved to be an excellent hiking companion, her young legs tireless and her eyes sharp for interesting details along the way. "The trees are different here," she observed, as they climbed higher up the mountainside. "They're bigger and older than the ones near the cabin." She was right. The forest around them felt primeval, untouched by logging or development. Some of the Douglas firs stretched more than 200 feet into the sky, their trunks so massive that Emma could barely reach a quarter of the way around them with outstretched arms. The compass needle grew more agitated as they climbed, spinning faster and pointing more insistently in a specific direction. Finally, after 2 hours of hiking, they crested a small ridge and found themselves looking down into a hidden valley that didn't appear on any of their modern topographical maps. At the valley's heart was a small tarn, an alpine lake fed by a waterfall that cascaded down from the peaks above. But what made both father and daughter gasp was the structure they could see beneath the crystal-clear water. "Is that a building?" Emma whispered. Through 20 feet of mountain-pure water, they could make out what appeared to be stone foundations laid in a perfect circle. The craftsmanship was unmistakable, the same precision and artistry they'd seen in their floating cabin, but on a much larger scale. The compass in Emma's hands had gone completely still, its needle pointing directly at the submerged structure. "Magnus built something here too," Ethan murmured, pulling out the hand-drawn map they'd brought from the cabin. Sure enough, this location was marked with the same tree and water symbol they'd seen on the wooden tokens. Emma was already exploring the shoreline, her natural curiosity overriding any sense of caution. "Daddy, look at this!" She'd found a stone cairn, partially hidden beneath a century of fallen leaves and forest debris. When they cleared it away, they discovered the stack included several carved markers that matched symbols from Magnus's journals. But most remarkable was what they found when Emma's probing fingers discovered a loose stone near the cairn's base. Hidden beneath was another small cache, this one containing a waterproof pouch made from what appeared to be specially treated leather. Inside the pouch were more maps, more detailed than anything they'd found in the cabin. These showed not just the locations of hidden structures, but underwater approaches, seasonal water level variations, and most intriguingly, what appeared to be a network of connections between all the sites. "It's like he built a whole secret world," Emma said, spreading the maps on a flat boulder where they could study them properly. The maps revealed at least 7 different locations around the main lake and its tributaries, each marked with specific symbols and connected by lines that seemed to indicate both physical and conceptual relationships. Some sites were marked with the tree and water symbol they'd already encountered. Others bore different marks: a stone arch, a spiral shell, a star reflected in water. As they studied the documents, Ethan began to understand that Magnus hadn't simply built isolated structures. He'd created an integrated system, each component designed to work in harmony with the others and with the natural landscape that contained them. "We need to tell someone about this," Ethan said finally, "but someone we can trust. Someone who'll understand what it means." Emma looked up from the maps with serious eyes. "Not Mr. Webb. Definitely not Mr. Webb." They carefully repackaged their discoveries and began the hike back to the cabin, both lost in thought about what they'd uncovered. The compass continued to point steadily toward the submerged structure until they'd hiked far enough away for the needle to settle into its normal searching pattern. That evening, Ethan called Professor Adelaide Wells at the regional university, someone Tom Kowalski had mentioned as being knowledgeable about local history. When he described their discoveries in general terms, without mentioning specific details, she immediately expressed intense interest. "Norse settlement artifacts from that period are extremely rare in this region," Professor Wells explained. "Over the phone, if you've genuinely found authenticated materials from Magnus Eriksson, you may have stumbled onto one of the most significant historical discoveries in decades." She agreed to drive up the following weekend to examine their findings, with the understanding that any academic publication would require their consent and that they retained full ownership of whatever they'd discovered. Ethan tucked Emma into bed that night. She looked up at him with the serious expression she wore when processing something important. "Daddy, I think Magnus wanted us to find all these places, not just the first one." "Why do you think that?" "Because the compass doesn't point to just one thing. It points to whatever we need to find next. And there are more symbols on the maps that we haven't seen yet." Lying in his own bed later, listening to the gentle lapping of water against their floating home, Ethan realized his 8-year-old daughter had grasped something that had eluded him. They weren't just discovering Magnus's legacy. They were following a path he deliberately laid out, designed to reveal itself to the right people at the right time. The question was, what was Magnus trying to lead them toward? And why did Marcus Webb seem to know more about it than he was letting on? Outside their windows, the lake reflected starlight like scattered diamonds, holding its secrets in depths that had remained undisturbed for centuries. But Ethan had the growing sense that their quiet life of healing and discovery was about to become something much more complex and potentially dangerous. The key made from whalebone was both beautiful and unsettling. Emma found it wrapped in oiled silk inside the most elaborate puzzle box yet, one that had required the combined efforts of both father and daughter to solve over 3 days of patient manipulation. The bone had been carved with such skill that it seemed to flow like frozen water, its surface covered in nautical charts so detailed they appeared to have been scrimshawed by someone who knew every current and depth of the lake. But it was the charts themselves that made Ethan's breath catch. They showed the lake as he'd never seen it, not just the surface that reflected sky and mountains, but the hidden topography beneath the water, underwater ridges, deep channels, and most remarkably, what appeared to be artificial structures, scattered across the lake floor. "Look, Daddy," Emma said, tracing one of the microscopic lines with her fingernail. "These aren't natural formations. They're too straight, too organized." She was developing an eye for Magnus's work, able to distinguish between natural features and the ancient craftsman's deliberate constructions. The whalebone key's charts suggested an entire underwater landscape that Magnus had not just mapped, but modified. Professor Adelaide Wells had arrived that morning, her small hybrid car packed with research materials and authentication equipment. A woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She'd spent 2 hours examining their discoveries with the reverence of someone who understood their significance. "These are authentic," she'd announced finally, her voice filled with wonder. The parchment, the ink compositions, even the woodworking techniques, everything corresponds to late 17th century Norse craftsmanship, but the level of sophistication is extraordinary. Magnus Eriksson wasn't just a skilled craftsman. He was a master innovator working centuries ahead of his time. Now, as afternoon light slanted through the cabin's windows, Professor Wells studied the whalebone key with particular intensity. "This changes everything we thought we knew about the scope of his work," she murmured. "Whalebone carving of this quality requires not just artistic skill, but deep knowledge of maritime navigation and underwater topography. The compass led us to a submerged structure yesterday," Ethan explained, showing her the location on Magnus's maps. "But according to this key, that's just one of many sites." Professor Wells nodded slowly. "I've spent 30 years studying Norse settlement patterns in North America. Most were coastal, designed around fishing and trade. But Magnus appears to have created something entirely different, an inland system focused on the lake itself." Emma had been quietly studying the key while the adults talked, her nimble fingers exploring its carved surface. Suddenly, she gasped with delight. "It opens something." She discovered that one section of the key's handle was actually a tiny hidden compartment. Inside was a scroll no larger than her thumb, covered in symbols they'd seen before, but never in this particular combination. Professor Wells examined the scroll with a magnifying glass, her excitement growing with each symbol she identified. "This appears to be a map legend," she said finally. "Each symbol corresponds to a different type of structure or function within Magnus's system. Working together, they began matching the legend symbols to locations on the larger maps. What emerged was a picture of remarkable complexity and purpose. Magnus hadn't simply built random structures around the lake. He'd created an integrated network designed to work in harmony with natural water systems, seasonal changes, and even astronomical events. "Look at this pattern," Professor Wells said, spreading several maps across the cabin's large dining table. "The spacing between sites isn't random. They're positioned to create geometric relationships with each other and with natural landmarks." Emma studied the patterns with her head tilted to one side. "It's like a giant puzzle," she announced. "Each piece has to be in the right place for the whole thing to work." Her childlike observation captured something the academic language had obscured. Magnus had designed his network as a unified system where each component enhanced and supported the others. But what was the purpose? Ethan wondered aloud. Why go to such elaborate effort to build all this? Before Professor Wells could respond, they heard the sound of multiple vehicles arriving at their dock. Through the windows they could see Marcus Webb stepping out of his SUV, followed by two other men in expensive outdoor gear, carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment. "Mr. Carter," Webb called out as he approached the cabin, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. My colleagues and I are conducting a historical survey of the area, and we'd love to include your property in our documentation." Ethan stepped outside, positioning himself between Webb and the cabin door. "I thought I made it clear yesterday that we're not interested." Of course," Webb replied smoothly. "But surely you understand the historical significance of what you have here. These structures deserve proper academic study." "We're already working with a qualified historian," Ethan said, indicating Professor Wells, who had joined him on the deck. Webb, quote, S expression, shifted slightly as he took in the professor's presence and the research materials visible through the open door. "Ah, Adelaide Wells, I should have known you'd surface eventually." Professor Wells's response was carefully neutral. "Hello, Marcus. Still collecting for your consortium?" The tension between them was palpable, suggesting a history that neither wanted to discuss in front of strangers. Webb's companions had begun setting up their equipment on the shore, clearly preparing to document the cabin whether permission was granted or not. "The historical significance of this site extends far beyond one family's claim," Webb said, his polished facade beginning to slip. "Artifacts of this caliber belong in proper museums, not hidden away in private collections." Emma had been watching the exchange from the doorway, still holding the whalebone key. Webb's eyes fixed on it immediately, and Ethan saw the man's jaw tighten with recognition. "That's a remarkable piece," Webb said, taking a step closer. "Norse, whalebone carving from the colonial period, extremely rare. I'd be happy to arrange for proper conservation. It's not going anywhere," Emma said firmly, clutching the key against her chest. Webb, quote, S mask slipped further, revealing something calculating and predatory beneath the scholarly pretense. "Little. Girl, you don't understand what you're playing with. Some artifacts carry responsibilities that children can't comprehend." The implied threat in his tone made Ethan's protective instincts flare. "I think it's time for you and your team to leave." "We're on public land," one of Webb's companions called out from the shoreline. "We have every right to document historical sites." Professor Wells stepped forward, her academic authority evident in her posture. "Actually, Marcus, you're on private property. The mineral and historical rights to this section of the lake were included in Mr. Carter's purchase." Webb's composure cracked completely. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, Adelaide. This goes far beyond academic curiosity. There are people with legitimate claims to Magnus's legacy, people who understand what he was really trying to accomplish." "And what was that?" Professor Wells asked quietly. For a moment, Webb seemed on the verge of revealing something significant. But then he caught himself, the professional mask sliding back into place. Historical preservation, of course, nothing more. But his eyes betrayed him, repeatedly returning to the whalebone key in Emma's hands and the research materials visible. In the cabin, whatever Webb was really after, it had nothing to do with historical preservation and everything to do with something specific. He believed Magnus had hidden after Webb and his team finally left, taking their equipment with them. The three researchers sat around the cabin's table in thoughtful silence. The confrontation had revealed undercurrents they were only beginning to understand. "You know him," Ethan said to Professor Wells. It wasn't a question. She nodded reluctantly. "Marcus Webb represents a network of private collectors who specialize in acquiring historically significant artifacts through questionable means. They're particularly interested in items that traditional academia has overlooked or dismissed." But why Magnus's work specifically? Professor Wells examined the whalebone key again, her expression troubled. Because I think Magnus discovered something that modern science is only beginning to understand. Look at these underwater charts. They show water patterns, temperature variations, and structural relationships that shouldn't have been possible to map with 17th century technology. Emma had been studying the charts with her magnifying glass, her young eyes better able to discern the finest details. Professor Wells, she said suddenly, these numbers here, they match the ones in Magnus's journals. The ones about water, levels and moon phases. Both adults leaned closer as Emma pointed out connections they'd missed. The charts weren't just maps, they were operational manuals showing how Magnus's underwater structures worked in relationship to natural cycles. He was harnessing natural forces, Professor Wells breathed. Water flow, seasonal variations, tidal effects even this far inland. This is environmental engineering centuries ahead of its time, and worth $25 million. Ethan asked, remembering the figure from the title that had drawn them into this mystery. Potentially much more than that, Professor Wells replied soberly. If Magnus developed sustainable technologies that we're only now beginning to understand, his work could be invaluable to addressing modern environmental challenges. As evening settled over the lake, they secured their discoveries and began planning their next steps. The whalebone key had revealed not just new information about Magnus's network, but also the presence of people who would stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. Emma fell asleep that night with the key under her pillow, trusting her 8-year-old instincts about its importance. But Ethan lay awake, listening to the gentle sounds of their floating home and wondering what forces they'd unknowingly set in motion outside their windows. The lake held its secrets in depths that had remained undisturbed for centuries. But now those secrets were stirring, and Ethan had the growing certainty that their quiet life of discovery was about to become something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The silver locket was the most personal artifact they'd discovered. Emma found it sealed within a specially designed compartment in Magnus's most elaborate journal, a space so perfectly fitted that the locket seemed to have grown from the book's binding. The silver had been polished to mirror brightness despite its age, and when Emma's careful fingers found the hidden clasp, it opened to reveal a miniature portrait painted with heartbreaking skill. The woman in the portrait had kind eyes and golden hair that caught light like spun sunbeams, but it was her expression that made both Ethan and Emma catch their breath, a look of infinite sadness mixed with enduring love, as if she were gazing across an impossible distance towards someone she could never reach again. She looks lonely, Emma whispered, tracing the locket's edge with one finger, like she's waiting for someone who isn't coming back. Professor Wells had returned for an extended stay, setting up a temporary research station in the cabin's main room with Ethan's permission. Her authentication equipment confirmed what they'd all sensed. The locket was contemporary with Magnus's other work, crafted with the same extraordinary skill that marked everything he'd created. But it was the journal's newly revealed pages that provided the emotional context they'd been missing. In entries dated throughout 1691 and 1692, Magnus wrote about his lost love with a grief so raw it seemed to leap from the centuries-old pages. Her name was Astrid, Ethan read aloud, translating the clearest passages. She was to join me in the New World, but plague took her before the ship could sail. I came here to escape the memories, but I find I am building them into every beam and stone. The journal entries revealed Magnus as more than just a master craftsman. They showed him as a man fleeing unbearable loss, seeking healing through his connection to the natural world. His work around the lake wasn't just innovative architecture, but a form of meditation, a way of processing grief by creating beauty that would outlast his pain. Listen to this, Professor Wells said, reading from another journal entry. I build not for the living alone, but for those yet to come, who will understand what it means to lose everything and still find reason to create. The lake holds sorrow, as well as joy, and both must be honored in what I make. Emma looked up from her careful study of the Locket's portrait. He was like you, Daddy. He lost someone he loved and had to figure out how to keep going. The simple observation hit Ethan with unexpected force. Sarah's death had driven him to seek solitude with Emma, just as Astrid's loss had driven Magnus to this remote lake centuries earlier. Both had found themselves building new lives in the shadow of grief, guided by love for someone they couldn't protect. But Magnus found a way to turn his sadness into something beautiful, Emma continued with 8-year-old wisdom. Maybe that's why we were meant to find his things. Over the following days, they delved deeper into Magnus's personal writings, finding more references to Astrid and to his growing understanding of how to channel grief into creative purpose. The locket appeared to have been his constant companion during those early years, a reminder of what he'd lost, but also of why his work mattered. The journal entries also revealed practical details about Magnus's techniques. He described waiting for specific seasonal conditions before beginning construction, choosing materials not just for their physical properties, but for their connection to natural cycles. His underwater structures were built during winter when the lake level was lowest, designed to work with seasonal variations rather than fighting against them. Most remarkably, Magnus had developed ways of making his buildings responsive to their environment. He wrote about teaching wood to remember and helping stone find its proper song. While the language sounded mystical, Professor Wells believed it described advanced understanding of how materials behaved under different conditions. He was manipulating the natural properties of his materials in ways that modern science is only beginning to understand, she explained, as they studied Magnus's technical drawings. These joints aren't just mechanically sound, they're designed to flex and adjust as temperature and humidity change. Emma had been spending hours each day working with Magnus's puzzle boxes, developing an intuitive understanding of his design principles that surpassed even Professor Wells's academic knowledge. Her small fingers could sense subtleties in the wood that escaped adult perception, and she'd begun creating her own simple puzzles using driftwood collected from the shoreline. Magnus made everything alive, she announced one morning, successfully opening a puzzle box that had stymied the sow. Adults for days. The wood wants to move in certain ways, and if you listen to it, it tells you the answer. Her comment sparked an important realization for Professor Wells. Magnus hadn't just been working with dead materials. He'd been creating partnerships between human intention and natural intelligence. His buildings weren't imposed upon the landscape, but grew from it, designed to enhance rather than dominate their environment. This explains why your cabin feels so harmonious, Professor Wells said. Magnus understood something about the relationship between consciousness and matter that we're only beginning to rediscover. But their deepening understanding of Magnus's work also brought growing awareness that they weren't the only ones seeking his secrets. Marcus Webb had returned twice more, each time with different pretenses, but always focusing on the same goal: gaining access to their discoveries. During his most recent visit, Webb had brought a woman introduced as Dr. Sarah Chen, supposedly an expert in historic preservation. But Emma had noticed something the adults missed. Dr. Chen's questions weren't about preservation at all, but about the functional aspects of Magnus's designs. She wanted to know how the puzzle boxes worked, Emma reported after the visitors had left, and she was really interested in the compass and the maps showing underwater things. Webb's persistence was becoming increasingly troubling. He'd made inquiries in Pine Ridge about property rights, spoken with local officials about historical significance assessments, and even attempted to contact the university about Professor Wells's research. Each approach was professionally presented, but carried an undercurrent of threat. He's building a legal case, Professor Wells warned during one of their evening strategy sessions. If he can establish that your discoveries have national historical significance, he might be able to force government intervention. The thought of losing Magnus's legacy to bureaucratic seizure motivated them to accelerate their research. Using the silver locket as a focusing lens, Emma had discovered it somehow enhanced her ability to understand Magnus's puzzles. They began exploring the lake systematically, following the whalebone keys charts to underwater sites they'd previously only theorized about. What they found exceeded their wildest expectations. The first dive, conducted with borrowed scuba equipment and Professor Wells serving as safety coordinator, revealed that the submerged structure they'd glimpsed from above was actually the top of a much larger complex. Stone foundations extended 30 feet, down into the lake's depths, supporting what appeared to be a complete building designed to function underwater. "The craftsmanship is incredible," Ethan reported through his diving communicator. "Every joint is perfectly sealed, but not with any material I recognize. It's like the stones themselves have formed waterproof bonds." Swimming through chambers, filled with crystal-clear lake water, he found furniture carved from single blocks of stone, walls covered with the same intricate symbols they'd seen in Magnus's journals, and most remarkably, a series of channels that seemed designed to guide water flow in specific patterns. "It's not just a building," he realized, surfacing to share his discoveries. "It's a machine of some kind, designed to work with the lake's natural currents." Emma, who had insisted on wearing diving gear despite her age, proved to be a natural underwater explorer. Her small size allowed her to access areas that challenged even experienced divers, and her intuitive understanding of Magnus's work guided her to discoveries the adults might have missed in the deepest chamber. Behind a stone panel that opened only to specific pressure combinations, she found Magnus's most personal treasure, a collection of letters written in Astrid's hand, preserved in specially sealed containers that had kept them perfect for 3 centuries. She was coming to join him, Emma reported excitedly after they'd surfaced and returned to the cabin. She had plans for their life together, drawings of gardens and children, and growing old by the lake. The letters revealed Astrid as Magnus's intellectual equal, a woman who understood his vision and intended to help him realize it. Her sketches showed buildings that complemented his architectural style, gardens designed to work with his water management systems, and community spaces meant for the family they'd planned to raise together. Reading Astrid's words while holding her portrait in the silver locket, Ethan felt a connection that transcended the centuries between them. Like him, Magnus had lost the person who made all his dreams meaningful. But unlike him, Magnus had found a way to honor that loss by creating something that would help others facing similar challenges. He wasn't just building for himself, Ethan realized, reading one of Astrid's letters aloud. She writes about their work being a gift to future generations who will need to remember how to live in harmony with the natural world. That evening, as they catalogued their underwater discoveries and worked to decode more of Magnus's technical documentation, Emma made an observation that changed their understanding of everything they'd found. "The silver locket doesn't just have Astrid's picture," she said, holding it up to the lamplight. "Look at the back. Etched so finely it was almost invisible were the same symbols they'd been finding throughout Magnus's network, but arranged. In this configuration, they formed something new, what appeared to be a master key to understanding all the other symbols they'd encountered." Using the locket's symbolic Rosetta Stone, Professor Wells began translating Magnus's more complex technical notes. What emerged was a picture of genius that took her breath away. Magnus hadn't just built individual structures around the lake. He'd created an integrated system for sustainable living that anticipated environmental challenges humanity wouldn't face for centuries. His underwater buildings were designed to purify water using natural processes. His floating structures adjusted automatically to seasonal variations. His positioning of sites created a network that enhanced the lake's natural ecosystem rather than disrupting it. "This is worth more than 25 million," Professor Wells said finally. "This is knowledge that could reshape how we approach sustainable architecture and environmental restoration." But even as they marveled at Magnus's genius, they couldn't escape the growing sense that their discoveries had attracted dangerous attention. Webb's inquiries were becoming more aggressive, and Emma had reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles parked at distant vantage points around the lake. "Someone's watching us," she announced matter-of-factly during dinner. "They think they're being sneaky, but I can see their binoculars reflecting sunlight." The 8-year-old's observation skills had become frighteningly acute. Living with Magnus's puzzles and codes had sharpened her ability to notice patterns and details that escaped adult attention. As Ethan tucked her into bed that night, the silver locket safely stored with their other treasures, Emma looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy, I think we're going to have to protect Magnus's secret from people who want to use it wrong." "What do you mean?" "Magnus and Astrid wanted to help people learn to live better. But Mr. Webb wants to take everything away and sell it to people who won't care about that." Her childlike clarity cut through all the complex legal and academic considerations to the heart of what mattered. They weren't just guardians of historical artifacts, they were protectors of a vision that could help humanity address challenges Magnus had foreseen centuries before they became critical. Looking at his daughter's determined expression, illuminated by the same lamplight that had revealed Magnus's secrets, Ethan realized their quiet life of healing and discovery was about to become something else entirely. A battle to preserve wisdom that the world desperately needed, but didn't yet know how to value. The carved whale-tooth scrimshaw was Emma's most remarkable find yet. She discovered it in a location that shouldn't have existed, a hidden chamber within their own cabin that had somehow escaped detection during weeks of thorough exploration. The chamber revealed itself only after Emma began tracing the silver locket symbols along the cabin's interior walls, following a pattern that seemed to respond to her touch like a combination lock written in wood and stone. "It was always here," she announced with 8-year-old certainty as the section of wall swung inward to reveal a space perfectly sized for a child. "Magnus made it for someone like me." The scrimshaw itself was a masterpiece of storytelling, etched onto whalebone with microscopic precision. Every inch of the curved surface had been carved with scenes that flowed together like frames in an elaborate movie, telling the complete story of Magnus's journey from grief to purpose to ultimate triumph. Professor Wells examined it with a magnifying glass and professional awe. "This is museum-quality work," she breathed. "But more than that, it's a complete documentation of Magnus's philosophy and methods. Everything we've been trying to piece together from scattered journals and artifacts is here in one comprehensive narrative." The scrimshaw began with Magnus's life in Norway, showing him as a young craftsman working alongside a woman who could only be Astrid. Their happiness radiated from the carved scenes, workshops filled with projects, shared meals, plans sketched together by candlelight. But the story darkened quickly, depicting Astrid's illness and death with artistic restraint that made the tragedy more powerful than any dramatic rendering could have achieved. Following the narrative around the whale-tooth's curve, they watched Magnus's journey to the new world, his discovery of the alpine lake, and his gradual understanding that his grief could be transformed into something that would outlast both sorrow and loss. The middle section showed him developing his revolutionary building techniques, learning to work with natural forces rather than against them. But it was the final third of the scrimshaw that took their breath away. Magnus hadn't just built individual structures around the lake. He'd created the surface components of an enormous floating city designed to rise from the water when conditions were right. The scrimshaw showed the complete vision. interconnected buildings that could adjust their height and configuration based on water levels, seasonal changes, and the needs of their inhabitants. "Look at this section," Emma said, pointing to a detailed carving near the scrimshaw's base. "He made it so families could live on the water without hurting the lake." She was right. The drawings showed architectural systems that enhanced rather than disrupted natural processes, buildings that purified water as it flowed through them, living spaces that provided both privacy and community, gardens that floated on the surface, while their roots cleaned and oxygenated the water below. "This is beyond revolutionary," Professor Wells murmured, making careful sketches of the scrimshaw's technical diagrams. Magnus was designing sustainable communities centuries before anyone understood why they'd be necessary. But even as they marveled at Magnus's vision, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Emma had reported more surveillance activity around the lake, and Marcus Webb's legal maneuvering was becoming increasingly aggressive. That afternoon, their sense of growing threat was confirmed when Tom Kowalski arrived at their dock in his fishing boat, his expression grim with concern. "You folks need to know what you're dealing with," he said without preamble. "That Webb character has been asking questions in town about your legal status here, claiming you might be disturbing protected historical sites." "Protected by whom?" Ethan asked. "That's the thing. Nobody's quite sure. Webb's produced documentation suggesting this area might fall under federal jurisdiction for historical preservation. But Anna did some checking with her cousin who works for the Park Service, and there's no record of any such designation." Professor Wells frowned. "Forged documents, or documents that will become real if Webb gets his way," Tom replied. "He's been meeting with lawyers, talking about emergency injunctions to protect invaluable cultural resources from amateur interference." The threat was becoming clearer. Webb couldn't simply take Magnus's discoveries by force, but he might be able to orchestrate legal seizure by claiming they were too historically significant to remain in private hands. Emma had been listening with the serious expression she wore when processing adult concerns. "Can they really take away our home?" "Not if we can help it," Ethan assured her, though privately he wondered what resources they could marshal against Webb's obviously well-funded operation. That evening, as they studied the scrimshaw by lamplight, Emma made another of her intuitive leaps that consistently amazed the adults. "Magnus knew this would happen," she announced, pointing to a section of the carving they'd initially overlooked. "He made plans for protecting his work from people who would use it wrong." The section she'd identified showed Magnus not just as builder but as guardian, creating what appeared to be defensive measures integrated into his architectural systems. Some buildings were designed to conceal themselves when threatened. Others could literally sink beneath the water's surface if approached by hostile forces. "He was centuries ahead of his time in more ways than we realized," Professor Wells said, studying the defensive schematics. "These aren't just sustainable buildings. They're adaptive systems designed to protect themselves and their inhabitants." Working late into the night, they began to understand that Magnus had anticipated exactly the situation they now faced. He'd foreseen that his innovations would eventually attract those who would exploit rather than honor his vision. The scrimshaw included detailed instructions for activating the protective measures he'd built into every structure. But the instructions required something they didn't yet possess: direct access to what the scrimshaw called the heart of the network, apparently located in the deepest part of the floating city that remained hidden beneath the lake's surface. "We need to find the central structure," Professor Wells concluded. "According to this, everything Magnus built was designed to respond to commands issued from that location." Emma had fallen asleep over her sketches, but even in sleep, her hand remained protectively curled around the silver locket. Her connection to Magnus's work continued to deepen in ways that defied explanation, but couldn't be denied. The next morning brought unwelcome confirmation of their worst fears. Marcus Webb arrived with a full legal team, and what appeared to be federal marshals bearing official-looking documents that claimed jurisdiction over their property pending emergency historical preservation assessment. "I'm sorry it's come to this," Webb said, though his expression suggested anything but regret. "But artifacts of this significance can't be left in amateur hands. You'll be compensated fairly for any inconvenience." Professor Wells examined the legal documents with academic skepticism. "These are preliminary injunctions at best, Marcus. They'll never hold up under serious legal challenge." "Perhaps not," Webb agreed. "But they'll hold long enough for proper assessment of the site's contents. I'm sure you understand the importance of protecting cultural heritage from well-meaning but unqualified interference." Emma emerged from the cabin carrying the whale-tooth scrimshaw, her young face set with determination that reminded Ethan powerfully of Sarah's stubborn streak. "This doesn't belong to you," she told Webb with 8-year-old directness. "Magnus made it for people who would understand what it means." Webb's eyes fixed on the scrimshaw with barely concealed hunger. "That's exactly why it needs proper conservation, little one. Amateur handling could damage irreplaceable historical evidence." But as Webb reached for the artifact, something unexpected happened. The scrimshaw seemed to grow warm in Emma's hands, and the carved scenes began to shift, not dramatically but subtly, as if the microscopic figures were adjusting their positions in response to her touch. Everyone present saw it happen, but no one could quite believe what they'd witnessed. Webb quotes. Professional composure cracked completely. "Give me that artifact," he demanded, dropping all pretense of scholarly concern. "You have no idea what forces you're meddling with." His reaction confirmed what Ethan had begun to suspect. Webb knew far more about Magnus's work than he'd admitted. This wasn't academic curiosity, or even simple greed. Webb was part of something larger, something that had been seeking Magnus's legacy for reasons that went far beyond historical preservation. "I think it's time for you and your people to leave," Ethan said firmly, positioning himself between Webb and Emma. "You can't interfere with federal preservation efforts," one of the marshals warned. But Professor Wells had been reading the legal documents more carefully. "Actually, these papers don't grant access to the property itself, only the right to. You conduct external assessment. Mr. Carter is within his rights to deny entry to his home." The standoff stretched taut as Webb calculated his options. Finally, he stepped back with visible reluctance. "This isn't over," he warned. "Magnus Eriksson's legacy belongs to humanity, not to one family. We'll be back with proper authority after." The officials departed. The 3 researchers sat in heavy silence, understanding that their quiet life of discovery had officially ended. They were now guardians of something that powerful forces would stop at nothing to claim. "We need to reach the heart of the network before Webb can return with stronger legal backing," Professor Wells said finally. Emma looked up from the scrimshaw, which had returned to its normal state, but somehow felt more alive in her hands than ever before. "Magnus is trying to tell us something," she said with quiet conviction. "The scrimshaw is like a key, but we need to find the right lock." Looking at his daughter's determined expression and the priceless artifact she held with such natural authority, Ethan realized they were about to discover whether Magnus's defensive systems could protect his legacy from those who would exploit rather than honor it. Magnus' master blueprint was hidden where only someone who truly understood his vision could find it, not in any cache or secret compartment, but woven into the very structure of their floating cabin. Emma discovered it during what should have been a routine morning, her 8-year-old hands tracing the carved patterns in the walls while she waited for breakfast. "Daddy, the carvings are moving," she announced with the same matter-of-fact tone she used to report interesting cloud formations. But when Ethan and Professor Wells joined her, they saw what she meant. The intricate wood carvings that decorated every surface of the cabin weren't just decorative. They were architectural diagrams rendered in 3 dimensions. When viewed from the proper angles and with the correct lighting, the flowing patterns revealed technical drawings of breathtaking complexity. "The entire cabin is a blueprint," Professor Wells whispered, running her hands along carvings that suddenly made perfect sense as structural specifications. Magnus turned his home into a living manual for everything he built. Using mirrors and lamps to properly illuminate different sections, they began to see the true scope of Magnus's achievement. The floating cabin wasn't just the tip of an iceberg. It was the control center for an entire floating city designed to rise from the lake's depths when conditions were right. The blueprint revealed 17 interconnected structures of varying sizes, each designed to serve specific functions within a completely sustainable community. Some were residential buildings that could house families while moving gently with the water's natural rhythms. Others were workshop spaces designed for crafts and trades. Most remarkably, there were agricultural platforms that could grow food, while purifying water and enhancing the lake's natural ecosystem. "This isn't just revolutionary architecture," Professor Wells said, her voice filled with awe. "This is a complete reimagining of how human communities can exist in harmony with natural systems." Emma had been studying the blueprint's most intricate sections, her young eyes better able to discern the finest details. "Look at these numbers," she said, pointing to sequences of symbols carved so small they were barely visible. "They match the ones in Magnus's weather journals." She was right. The city wasn't just designed to rise from the water. It was programmed to do so only when specific environmental conditions were met. Magnus had created a system that would reveal itself when humanity most needed the knowledge it contained. The current water temperature, seasonal timing, even lunar phases, Ethan realized, checking Magnus's calculations against modern meteorological data. "According to this, all the conditions will align in 3 days." "Align for what?" Professor Wells asked. Emma. S finger traced the blueprint's central diagram, where all the structural elements converged. "For the city to wake up," she said with absolute certainty. The revelation changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. They weren't just protecting historical artifacts. They were guardians of a living system that Magnus had designed to activate when humanity faced the environmental challenges he'd foreseen centuries in advance. But their moment of wonder was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching their dock. Through the windows, they could see Marcus Webb returning with an even larger team, including what appeared to be diving equipment and underwater excavation gear. This time, Webb didn't bother with legal pretense. "We know what you have," he called out as he approached the cabin. "The question is whether you're willing to cooperate voluntarily or force us to take more direct action." Ethan stepped outside, Professor Wells beside him, while Emma remained in the cabin with strict instructions to stay hidden, but even from inside, her clear voice carried across the water. "You can't have Magnus's city," she announced through an open window. "It doesn't belong to people who would use it wrong." Webb's expression shifted from professional determination to something approaching obsession. "That child has no comprehension of what she's interfering with. The technologies Magnus developed could solve global water shortage, revolutionize sustainable energy, transform how we approach climate change. They're too important to remain buried in a lake." "Then why not work with the academic community?" Professor Wells demanded. "Why the secrecy, the legal maneuvering, the threats?" For the first time, Webb's carefully maintained composure cracked completely. "Because academic bureaucracy would take decades to understand what Magnus accomplished. While the world is running out of time, there are forces at work: environmental collapse, resource depletion, social instability that require immediate action." His passion was real, but Ethan sensed something else beneath it, a desperation that suggested Webb was under pressure from sources he hadn't revealed. Who do you really represent? Ethan asked. Webb hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Consortium of international interests dedicated to preventing global environmental catastrophe. Magnus's innovations could provide solutions we desperately need, but only if they're implemented immediately and on a massive scale. And you think seizure and commercialization is the answer? I think sentiment and legal niceties are luxuries we can't afford, Webb shot back. Magnus designed his systems to help humanity survive what's coming. He'd want them used, not preserved. As museum pieces. Emma's voice drifted from the cabin again, carrying a note of authority that seemed far beyond her years. Magnus wanted them used by people who understood his reasons, people who would honor Astrid's memory and help families. Instead of hurting them, the mention of Astrid made Webb flinch visibly. How could she possibly know about? He stopped himself, but the slip revealed more than he'd intended. Webb knew details about Magnus's personal history that he shouldn't have been able to discover through conventional research. You've been searching for Magnus's work for a long time, Professor Wells realized. This isn't a recent discovery for you. Webb's team had begun unloading their equipment, clearly preparing for diving operations, whether permission was granted or not. But as they worked, something extraordinary began to happen. The lake itself seemed to be responding to the threat. The water around their dock grew choppy, despite the lack of wind. Fish began jumping in patterns that looked almost like warnings. Most remarkably, the floating cabin's gentle swaying became more pronounced, as if it were trying to communicate something. Emma emerged from the cabin carrying the whale-tooth scrimshaw, but now the carved scenes were clearly moving, shifting, and rearranging themselves to show new pictures. The current scene depicted Magnus's floating city rising from the depths while hostile forces fled in confusion. "It's starting," Emma announced with calm certainty. "Magnus's city wants to wake up, and it doesn't like these people." Webb stared at the animated scrimshaw with expressions that mixed greed with genuine fear. "The artifacts are activating," he whispered to his team. "We need to move fast before the full system comes online." But before his divers could enter the water, the lake itself intervened. What had been gentle choppiness became genuine waves, despite the absence of any wind. The water temperature began to rise noticeably, creating mists that hadn't been present moments before. Most remarkably, shapes began to appear beneath the surface, geometric patterns that suggested massive structures stirring in the depths. "The environmental conditions are accelerating," Professor Wells observed, checking readings on her electronic instruments. "Something is triggering the activation sequence ahead of Magnus's calculated timeline." Emma held up the silver locket, which was now warm enough to be uncomfortable to touch. "It's because of Magnus and Astrid," she said with absolute conviction. "They know we need their help to protect the city from people who don't understand." Webb's team was struggling with equipment that had begun malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. Diving gear leaked despite being recently tested. Electronic instruments displayed impossible readings. Most unsettling, their boats seemed unable to maintain position, drifting away from the dock despite anchors and mooring lines. "The lake is protecting itself," Ethan realized, watching water push against Webb's vessels with purposeful force. "Impossible," Webb muttered, but his expression suggested he was beginning to believe what his eyes showed him. "Inanimate systems don't develop defensive capabilities." Emma's laugh was pure 8-year-old delight. "Magnus's buildings aren't inanimate. He made them alive, remember? And they know the difference between people who want to help and people who want to take." The truth of her statement became undeniable as shapes continued to rise from the lake's depths. Not full structures yet, but suggestions of them. Glimpses of walls, towers, and bridges that appeared and vanished like mirages made of water and light. Magnus quote, "S floating city was awakening, and it was making its own judgments about who deserved to witness its emergence." Webb made one last desperate attempt, shouting orders to his team about emergency salvage procedures and legal authority. But his words were lost in the sound of water singing, a harmonic vibration that seemed to emerge from the lake itself, beautiful and unmistakably defensive. As Webb and his people retreated to a safer distance, Emma stood on the dock, holding Magnus's artifacts, her small figure somehow commanding in the face of forces beyond anyone's complete understanding. "Tomorrow," she announced, reading meanings in the water's movement that escaped adult comprehension, "Magnus's city will rise tomorrow, when the moon is right. And then everyone will see what he really built," looking at his daughter silhouetted against the mysterious lake, surrounded by artifacts that seemed more alive than any historical relics should be. Ethan realized they were about to witness something that would change not just their understanding of the past, but their hope for the future. The question was whether they could protect Magnus's legacy long enough for the world to understand what it meant. Magnus, quote, "S final letter," was written in his own hand on parchment that had somehow remained flexible, despite its age. Emma found it sealed inside the cabin's cornerstone, a hiding place that revealed itself only when she pressed the silver locket against a specific carving at exactly sunrise. The letter bore a date from 1695, just months before Magnus's final disappearance from all historical records. "To those who come after, who understand that creation born from love cannot be owned by those who serve only greed," Emma read aloud. In her clear, 8-year-old voice, the words seemed to resonate through the cabin's walls, as if the structure itself recognized its builder's final message. Marcus Webb had returned before dawn, with a small army of technicians, lawyers, and what appeared to be military contractors. But they maintained a careful distance from the dock, their equipment arrayed on the shoreline like a siege camp. The lake's defensive behavior from the previous day had clearly shaken their confidence, but their determination remained undiminished. "The activation sequence has begun," Webb announced through a megaphone, his voice carrying across the water. "We have legal authority to protect this site from amateur interference that could damage irreplaceable resources." Professor Wells examined his latest documentation through binoculars. "More authentic-looking papers," she reported grimly. "And those aren't just contractors. Some of those people have government clearances." But Emma seemed unconcerned by the gathering forces. She continued reading Magnus's letter with serene focus, occasionally pausing to translate passages from Old Norse with intuitive accuracy that amazed even Professor Wells. "Magnus knew this would happen," Emma announced, looking up from the parchment. "He wrote about people who would come with great power and small wisdom, trying to claim what they couldn't understand." The letter revealed Magnus's final preparations, made in the knowledge that his time was ending, but his work would continue. He'd spent his last years refining the floating city's defensive systems, ensuring it would reveal itself only to guardians who shared his values of harmony, sustainability, and respect for the natural world. Most remarkably, Magnus had designed the awakening process to be triggered not by mechanical switches or predetermined timers, but by human intention. The city would rise fully only when approached by those whose hearts resonated with its purpose. "It's reading us," Emma said with absolute certainty, holding up the silver locket, which had grown warm against her palm. "The city knows who we are and why we're here." As if responding to her words, the lake began to change more dramatically than ever before. The water level rose noticeably, lifting their floating cabin higher. Currents appeared where none had existed before, creating geometric patterns that reflected the blueprint hidden in their walls. Most remarkable was the music. Harmonic vibrations that seemed to emerge from the water itself, creating melodies that were both hauntingly beautiful and unmistakably purposeful. The sound carried emotional resonance that bypassed rational thought, speaking directly to something deeper than conscious understanding. Webb, team struggled with equipment that continued to malfunction in increasingly dramatic ways. Electronics sparked and died, mechanical devices seized without apparent cause. Even their vehicles began experiencing mysterious problems that stranded several team members on the wrong side of the lake. The defensive systems are more sophisticated than we anticipated, Webb admitted during a shouted conference with his remaining technicians. We need to accelerate our timeline before full activation makes intervention impossible. Professor Wells had been monitoring the lake's changes with her scientific instruments, documenting phenomena that challenged everything she thought she knew about physics and environmental science. The water temperature is rising uniformly throughout the entire body of water, she reported with scientific wonder. But the heating isn't coming from any external source. It's being generated by the structures themselves. Emma nodded, as if this were perfectly obvious. Magnus made the city alive, remember? It's waking up like anything that's been sleeping for a long time. Her childlike acceptance of the impossible helped the adults process events that exceeded their normal frameworks for understanding reality. Magnus hadn't just built innovative architecture. He'd created something that transcended the boundary between living and inanimate matter. The morning progressed with escalating tension as Webb's desperation became increasingly apparent. His legal documents were impressive, but they were meaningless in the face of natural forces that refused to acknowledge human authority. His technical expertise was considerable, but it was useless against systems that operated by principles he didn't understand. Professor Wells had taken detailed readings throughout the night, documenting changes that would revolutionize multiple scientific fields if anyone would believe her reports. The electromagnetic signatures coming from beneath the lake are unlike anything in scientific literature, she explained to Ethan. Magnus somehow created technology that operates by integrating consciousness with matter. Emma had spent the pre-dawn hours in quiet communion with Magnus's artifacts, her small hands tracing patterns that seemed to respond to her touch. The whale-tooth scrimshaw showed new scenes with each examination, glimpses of Magnus's daily life, his grief over Astrid, and his gradual understanding of how to channel personal loss into universal healing. He loved her so much that he built all this to help other people not hurt the way he hurt, Emma said simply, her 8-year-old wisdom cutting through centuries of complexity to reach the emotional truth at the heart of Magnus's work. As the sun climbed higher, the lake's transformation accelerated. Fish began jumping in coordinated patterns that created ripples matching the geometric designs in Magnus's blueprints. Waterbirds arrived in numbers that defied seasonal patterns, their cries adding harmony to the lake's growing symphony. Most remarkably, the local community began arriving at viewpoints around the lake. Tom and Anna Kowalski had spread word that something extraordinary was happening, and dozens of residents from Pine Ridge and surrounding areas gathered to witness events that would become local legend. One last offer, Webb called across the water as his team prepared what appeared to be assault boats equipped with diving gear and excavation equipment. Voluntary cooperation gets you full credit and substantial compensation. Resistance gets you nothing but legal troubles that will last for years. But his threats rang hollow in the face of forces that dwarfed human authority. The lake itself had become a participant in the confrontation, its waters moving with purpose that transcended natural currents or wind patterns. Emma stood on the dock holding Magnus's final letter, her small figure somehow commanding despite her size. The morning light caught the silver locket at her throat, creating prismatic reflections that danced across the water like scattered stars. Magnus says in his letter that the city belongs to children and families who need safe places to live, she announced, her voice carrying with startling clarity across the water. not to people who want to sell things or use them for power. Webb's response was lost in the growing harmonic vibrations that made normal speech increasingly difficult. The sound wasn't just beautiful, it was communicative, carrying meanings that bypassed language to touch something deeper in human consciousness. Then Emma did something that changed everything. She waded into the shallow water at the dock's edge, still holding Magnus's artifacts, and began to sing. Not words exactly, but musical tones that matched the frequencies emerging from the lake. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The water around her began to glow with phosphorescent light, and structures beneath the surface became clearly visible for the first time, not just shapes or shadows, but actual buildings rendered. In crystalline detail, she's communicating with it, Professor Wells whispered, watching Emma's interaction with phenomena that challenged every scientific principle she'd spent her career studying. Webb's team watched in stunned silence as the 8-year-old girl became the focal point for forces beyond their comprehension. Their expensive equipment and legal authority suddenly seemed insignificant compared to Emma's intuitive connection to Magnus's legacy. The water continued to rise around Emma, but instead of threatening to overwhelm her, it seemed to support and protect her small form. She stood waist-deep in glowing water, her voice joining the lake's symphony in harmonies that spoke of healing, hope, and the power of love to transcend even death. "Tomorrow morning," Emma announced, turning to face Webb's forces with perfect calm. "When the sun touches the water, Magnus's city will rise all the way to the surface. And then everyone will understand what he really built for us." Her words carried the authority of prophecy, spoken by a child who had become the living bridge between past wisdom and future hope. The artifacts in her hands pulsed with sympathetic light, their individual purposes now revealed as components in a vast system designed to awaken when humanity most needed the healing it could provide. The living wood core was revealed at dawn on the day Magnus had calculated 3 centuries in advance. As the first rays of sunlight touched the lake's surface, Emma placed her small hand against the carved tree symbol that decorated their cabin's central support beam. The ancient wood responded to her touch like a musical instrument finding its perfect pitch. What happened next would have seemed impossible if they hadn't been gradually prepared by weeks of increasingly miraculous discoveries. The support beam began to glow with warm, golden light that pulsed in rhythm with Emma's heartbeat. The glow spread outward through the cabin's walls, following the carved patterns that served as both decoration and circuitry. Marcus Webb's assault team, launched from the shoreline in high-tech boats, found themselves facing forces that rendered their equipment useless. As the living wood core awakened fully, the lake's defensive systems engaged with breathtaking sophistication. Water rose in walls that blocked their approach without touching them. Currents appeared from nowhere, guiding their boats away from the floating cabin with gentle but irresistible force. Most remarkably, their electronic systems began displaying impossible readings, as if reality itself were rejecting their presence. "Fall back and reassess," Webb ordered, his voice tight with frustration. But even as his team retreated, he couldn't take his eyes off Emma, who stood at the cabin's bow like a young ship's captain guiding her vessel through supernatural waters. The living wood core's awakening triggered responses throughout Magnus's network. One by one, the structures hidden beneath the lake began to rise, breaking the surface with majesty that took everyone's breath away. First came the residential buildings, graceful towers that seemed grown rather than built, their walls flowing like frozen water while maintaining perfect structural integrity. Each rose to a different height, creating a skyline that harmonized with the surrounding mountains while never competing with them. Next appeared the workshop buildings, their surfaces covered in the same intricate carvings that decorated the floating cabin, but on a scale that revealed their true complexity. These weren't just decorative patterns, they were functional elements that channeled water, air, and light in ways that enhanced both beauty and function. The agricultural platforms emerged last, revealing Magnus's most revolutionary innovation. These floating gardens didn't just grow on the water's surface, they extended deep into the lake, their root systems serving as living water filters that cleaned and oxygenated the entire ecosystem. Emma stood at the center of it all, her connection to the living wood core growing stronger as each new structure found its place in the expanding city. The artifacts she'd discovered over the previous weeks, the compass, the whalebone key, the silver locket, the scrimshaw, all glowed with sympathetic resonance, their individual functions now revealed as components in a vast organic system. Magnus built a living city, she announced, her 8-year-old voice filled with wonder and authority. Everything works together like a family. Professor Wells documented the emergence with scientific instruments that registered readings beyond their designed parameters. The structures rising from the lake weren't just architectural marvels, they represented technology centuries ahead of their time, seamlessly integrating consciousness with matter in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. Webb forces regrouped on the shoreline, their expensive equipment reduced to useless metal and plastic by the city's defensive systems. But Webb himself seemed transfixed by what he was witnessing, his obsession with claiming Magnus's legacy warring with genuine awe at its revelation. "Look at the water," Anna Kowalski called out from her position among the gathered townspeople. The lake's surface had become mirror-smooth, except where the rising structures created perfect ripples that spread outward in geometric patterns. The ripples weren't random. They carried information, creating a visual language that Emma seemed to read intuitively. "Magnus is showing us how everything connects," she explained, pointing to places where the expanding circles intersected. "Each building helps the others work better." As more structures reached the surface, the true genius of Magnus's design became apparent. This wasn't just a collection of individual buildings, it was an integrated organism where every component enhanced the function of every other component. The residential towers provided homes for families, while their flowing walls cleaned and recirculated water. The workshop buildings offered spaces for crafts and trades, while their carved surfaces generated natural heating and cooling. The agricultural platforms fed communities while their living root systems maintained the lake's ecological balance. Emma fully awakened the floating city when she sang the final verse of Magnus's song, a melody she'd never heard before, but somehow knew by heart. Her 8-year-old voice joined the harmonic frequencies emerging from the living wood core, creating resonance that completed circuits of intention and design that had waited 3 centuries for the right moment. The response was magnificent beyond imagination. The final structures rose from the lake's depths, revealing Magnus's masterpiece in its complete glory. 17 interconnected buildings formed a constellation of sustainable living that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the water itself. Webb team watched in stunned silence as their expensive boats were gently but firmly pushed away from the emerging city. The lake's defensive systems hadn't harmed them. They'd simply made it impossible for hostile forces to approach the awakening structures. "Impossible," Webb whispered, but his scientific skepticism was crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. Magnus hadn't just built innovative architecture, he'd created technology that transcended the boundary between living and inanimate matter. The Guardian's seal appeared as Emma's song reached its crescendo. Carved from the same living wood as the city's core, it rose from the lake's center on a pedestal that seemed grown from water itself. The seal bore symbols that matched those in Magnus's journals, but arranged in new configurations that spoke of completion acceptance, and the passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. Emma walked across the water's surface toward the seal, her small feet supported by forces that defied gravity. The townspeople gathered on the shorelines, watched in reverent silence as the 8-year-old girl approached what was clearly a moment of profound significance. "The seal chooses its own guardians," Professor Wells said softly, recognizing the scene from Magnus's scrimshaw carvings. "Emma isn't just discovering his legacy, she's accepting responsibility for protecting it." When Emma's hand touched the guardian's seal, light exploded across the water in patterns that matched the neural networks of living brains. The city wasn't just alive, it was intelligent, capable of making its own decisions about when to reveal itself and to whom. "I accept," Emma said simply, her child's voice carrying the weight of ancient oath-taking. "I promise to protect Magnus's work and help it help people." The seal responded by sinking into her palm, not as a physical object, but as a mark of authority that would remain with her always. The patterns of light that had danced across the water now centered on Emma, marking her as the city's chosen guardian. Webb made one final desperate attempt, launching himself from his stranded boat into the lake, but the water itself rejected his approach, creating currents that carried him back to shore despite his powerful swimming stroke. "You don't understand," he shouted across the water. "This technology could save millions of lives, prevent environmental collapse, revolutionize how humanity approaches sustainability." Emma turned to face him from her position at the city's heart, surrounded by structures that pulsed with gentle light. "Magnus made it to help people," she replied with perfect calm, "but only people who understand that some things can't be owned or sold." Her words carried across the water with supernatural clarity, reaching not just Webb, but everyone gathered around the lake's perimeter. The floating city wasn't just a technological marvel, it was a living demonstration of principles that could heal humanity's relationship with the natural world. The city's defensive capabilities became fully apparent as Webb's remaining team attempted various approaches. Underwater vessels found their controls locked by mysterious magnetic fields. Aircraft experienced instrument failures that forced immediate landings. Even satellite surveillance found its signals mysteriously blocked whenever cameras turned toward the lake. Magnus had designed his creation to protect itself from exploitation while remaining open to those who approached with respect and understanding. The technology was revolutionary, but it would only serve those who shared its creator's values of harmony, sustainability, and love for future generations. "The consortium I represent won't give up easily," Webb warned, treading water near the shoreline where currents had deposited him. "They have resources, legal authority, government connections." Emma's response was delivered with 8-year-old directness that cut through all his adult complications. "Magnus's city can take care of itself. It's been sleeping for 300 years, waiting for the right time. Now it's awake, and it gets to choose who it helps." As if to demonstrate her point, the city began displaying its capabilities. Water flowed through channels carved in the building's walls, emerging cleaner and more oxygenated than when it entered. Gardens sprouted from surfaces that had appeared to be solid stone, their roots extending deep into filtration systems that enhanced the lake's natural ecosystem. Most remarkably, the buildings adjusted their configuration based on changing conditions. As afternoon wind patterns shifted, the structures repositioned themselves to create optimal airflow. When clouds gathered, collecting surfaces extended to harvest rainwater, while architectural elements redirected it into storage and distribution networks. "It's completely sustainable," Professor Wells breathed, documenting systems that operated by principles centuries ahead of current environmental science. Magnus created architecture that enhances rather than depletes natural resources. The townspeople who had gathered to witness the awakening found themselves invited aboard the floating structures. not through any formal invitation, but through pathways of light that appeared on the water's surface, guiding those with open hearts toward the city's wonders. Tom and Anna Kowalski were among the first to accept the invitation, walking across. Bridges of crystallized water that supported their weight while remaining transparent beneath their feet. Their faces showed the wonder of children as they explored buildings that seemed grown rather than constructed. "Every family could have a home like this," Anna whispered, running her hands along walls that radiated warmth while maintaining perfect temperature control. Living on the water without harming it, growing food without depleting soil, creating beauty without creating waste. Webb's team made several more attempts to approach the city, but each effort was gently thwarted by defensive systems that operated more like immune responses than mechanical barriers. The city wasn't hostile toward them, it simply didn't recognize their intentions as compatible with its purpose. As evening approached, Webb finally admitted defeat. "This isn't over," he called to Emma, who stood at the Guardian's seal surrounded by light that seemed to emanate from her connection to Magnus's creation. "There are forces at work larger than one family's claims to historical artifacts." Emma's response carried the wisdom of someone far beyond her 8 years. Magnus knew about those forces. That's why he made the city able to protect itself and choose its own friends. As Webb and his remaining team departed, the floating city settled into its new existence with contented sighs that sounded like wind through ancient forests. The structures found their optimal positions for the night, their bioluminescent elements creating patterns that transformed the lake into a constellation of earth-bound stars. Ethan joined his daughter at the Guardian's seal, amazed by the transformation that had taken place not just in their environment, but in Emma herself. She carried herself with new confidence, her connection to Magnus's legacy having awakened capabilities that had always been present but never expressed. "Are you ready for the responsibility?" he asked gently. Emma smiled with 8-year-old joy, tempered by newfound understanding. "Magnus and Astrid will help me, and now we can help other families find safe places to live, just like they always wanted." Looking around at the floating city that had emerged from centuries of patient waiting, surrounded by townspeople whose faces showed wonder and hope rather than fear, Ethan realized they had witnessed something that would change not just their own lives, but the possibilities available to humanity itself. 6 months later, the floating city had become a beacon of hope that drew visitors from around the world. The new family portrait in antique frame, Emma's own creation, carved from driftwood and fitted with glass that somehow showed different images depending on the viewer's perspective, sat on the mantelpiece of their original cabin, now serving as the center of a much larger community. The portrait showed Ethan and Emma surrounded not just by Magnus's architectural wonders, but by the dozens of families who had come to learn from the floating city's sustainable technologies. Some stayed for weeks, others for months, but all left carrying knowledge that would help them create more harmonious relationships with their own environments. Emma had grown into her role as the city's primary interpreter with remarkable grace. Her 8-year-old wisdom, now tempered by months of experience, helped scientists and engineers understand principles that pure intellect couldn't grasp. She had developed her own teaching methods, using Magnus's puzzle boxes and artifacts to help visitors experience the relationship between consciousness and matter that made the city function. Magnus made everything work together because he understood that buildings should be alive, she explained to a group of architectural students from Sweden, her small hands demonstrating techniques for reading wood grain and stone texture. When you ask materials what they want to do, instead of forcing them, they help you build things that last forever. Professor Wells had established a formal research center in one of the city's workshop buildings, her academic credentials lending weight to discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about sustainable technology. The floating structures provided living laboratories for studying integrated systems that operated by principles decades ahead of current environmental science. We're documenting architectural innovations that could revolutionize how humanity approaches climate change, she explained to a United Nations Sustainability Committee that had come to evaluate the city's potential. But the real discovery is that these technologies only work when implemented by communities that understand their underlying philosophy. That philosophy, the integration of human intention with natural intelligence, had attracted attention from unexpected sources. Indigenous communities recognized principles their ancestors had always known. Environmental activists saw demonstrations of harmony they'd only dreamed possible. Even corporate leaders began to understand that true sustainability required approaches that enhanced rather than exploited natural systems. But Webb's consortium hadn't given up entirely. They'd attempted legal challenges, political pressure, and media campaigns designed to force government intervention. Each effort had failed, not through any dramatic confrontation, but because the floating city's defensive systems operated on levels that bureaucratic authority couldn't reach. The structures simply don't respond to mechanical analysis, reported a team of government engineers who'd spent weeks attempting to understand the city's operation. They appear to function through principles that integrate consciousness with matter in ways that exceed current scientific understanding. More significantly, the city had begun demonstrating capabilities that suggested it was still evolving. New structures occasionally rose from the lake's depths, their designs reflecting the needs of current residents while maintaining harmony with Magnus's original vision. Gardens expanded to accommodate new crops requested by visiting agricultural researchers. Workshop spaces reconfigured themselves to support different crafts and trades. "It's learning," Emma explained to her father during one of their evening walks along the city's floating pathways. Magnus made it smart enough to grow and change, but only in ways that help people and don't hurt the lake. The local community had transformed along with their environment. Pine Ridge had become an international destination for sustainable living. Research, bringing economic prosperity that enhanced rather than disrupted the area's natural beauty. Tom Kowalski had been elected mayor on a platform of protecting the lake while sharing its lessons with the world. Anna had opened a bed and breakfast that showcased traditional crafts alongside Magnus's innovations. Most remarkably, other discoveries had begun surfacing around the globe. Structures and artifacts that suggested Magnus hadn't been unique in his understanding of consciousness-based technology. Ancient sites in Norway, Ireland, and the Pacific Northwest showed evidence of similar principles, as if a network of knowledge guardians had once existed to preserve wisdom that humanity would eventually need. Magnus wasn't alone, Professor Wells reported during an international conference on sustainable architecture. We're finding evidence of a global community of innovators who understood that true technology must work in harmony with natural intelligence rather than opposing it. Emma had maintained her connection to the Guardian's seal, the mark that appeared on her palm whenever the city needed direct communication with its human guardians. But she'd also begun training other children, recognizing that Magnus's legacy required multiple guardians to ensure its preservation across generations. "Some kids just understand," she explained to parents who brought children to experience the floating city's educational programs. They can feel what the buildings want to do, just like I could. Magnus made sure there would always be people who could help if the adults forgot how to listen. The anniversary of the city's awakening brought visitors from 6 continents, including several who had attempted to exploit Magnus's discoveries but now sought to understand his philosophy. Webb himself had returned, not with legal documents or technical equipment, but with a letter of apology and a request to learn. "I spent so much time trying to possess what Magnus created that I never understood its true value," he admitted during a private conversation with Ethan and Emma. The real treasure isn't the technology, it's the wisdom that makes the technology possible. Emma, now 9 years old and wise beyond her years, accepted his apology with the grace of someone who had learned that healing required forgiveness as well as understanding. Magnus always knew that some people would need time to learn, she said simply. The important thing is that you finally want to understand instead of just taking. As evening fell on the anniversary celebration, the floating city displayed its most spectacular capability. The buildings coordinated their bioluminescent elements to create patterns that told Magnus's complete story. His love for Astrid, his journey to the lake, his gradual understanding of how to channel grief into creation that would outlast personal loss. But the display ended with new images. Scenes of families learning to live sustainably, communities healing their relationships with natural systems, and children like Emma carrying ancient wisdom into an uncertain future. Ethan stood with his daughter at the Guardian's seal, watching light dance across water that reflected both stars and the gentle glow of humanity's most hopeful experiment in sustainable living. The grief that had driven them to this remote lake had been transformed into something larger than personal healing, a legacy of hope that would continue, growing long after their own time had passed. Do you think Magnus and Astrid can see what we've done with their gift? Emma asked, her young voice carrying the weight of questions that connected past wisdom with future possibility. Ethan looked around at the floating city that had grown from centuries-old dreams filled with families from around the world learning to live in harmony with forces larger than themselves. In the gentle light that seemed to emanate from the structures themselves, he could almost see the faces of two lovers who had found a way to transform personal loss into universal healing. I think they're very proud of you, he said, wrapping his arm around his daughter's shoulders as they stood together at the heart of humanity's most profound lesson in the power of love to transcend even death itself. The lake lapped gently against the floating structures, carrying their reflections toward shores that would remember this story for generations yet to come. And somewhere in the harmony between human intention and natural intelligence, Magnus and Astrid's love continued to grow, nurturing dreams that would help families find safe harbor in an uncertain world.